At the age of 23, Felice Cohen was, like many college graduates, hesitant about entering the real world and at the same time uncertain about her sexuality. Focused on landing her first job as a writer, falling in love was the last thing on Felice's mind, but fall in love she did with her boss, Sarah, a woman 34 years older. It was a relationship that lasted 9 years, and for Felice, it was the first taste of true love and deep intimacy. But the affair took place in secrecy and ultimately ended in heartbreak. Now, Felice has written a book about her experience called Half In, a book that tells the story of an addictive May-December relationship that rocked Felice's personal world and reshaped the trajectory of her life. In the book, Felice describes a tumultuous relationship filled with emotional highs and also with devastatingly dark moments of fear, confusion, insecurity, and doubt. In this moving interview with PFLAG Cape Cod's Rick Koonce, Felice talks about how writing this coming-of-age memoir helped her to heal her hurting heart and bring her love for Sarah out of the closet. As Felice notes, writing about her love affair also helped her to make sense of a relationship that existed for years in the shadows and to acknowledge the lover who first introduced her to the mysteries of intimacy and passionate physical love. Felice Cohen, welcome to Profiles in LGBTQ Courage. It's wonderful to have you here today.
Thanks. It's wonderful to be here.
You have written a wonderful coming-of-age novel called Half In about your love affair with a woman who was 34 years older than you. And we really want to dive deep into this conversation, and I want to learn what you learned about love and about human nature, but tell me just briefly about the context for this book. What prompted you to write this?
Well, Sarah passed away about 10 years after our affair began. And to deal with it, I just started writing. I kept our affair was secret the whole time. It really has been secret until recently when the book came out. But to mourn her as I loved her in secret, the only way I knew how to do it was to write. And so I just started writing, and it had actually been prompted by a dream. And I just started writing, and I entered this one passage I had written into a contest, and it won. And it was at this event where I did a reading that an agent said, "Hey, how much of the book do you have done?" And I thought, what book? So I started working on it then. I mean, it was years and years ago. And during that time, I put the book down. I wrote 2 other books, but I always kept coming back to this story. And I realized I had to get it written for myself.
It was so figural, wasn't it? In your early life, you were 23 at the time. You were really finding your way, finding your identity. And Sarah came along. And I'm wondering if I could ask you to read that passage that we talked about as a stage setter for this conversation.
Sure. Sarah took my face in her hands and stared into my eyes as though asking for permission. I smiled back, granting it. She brought her lips to mine, and the sensation reached to my knees. Sarah's lips were thin, unlike Kimberly's, which were a suppler plum, but Sarah's lips were more disciplined. I could sense their intentionality and commitment to the kiss, and not simply the abandonment to passion. Something was exchanged in that kiss, something I wouldn't realize until much later and would be impossible to get back. My heart. Sarah took my hand and led me into the bedroom. I could have stopped. I could have said no, but I hadn't wanted to. All I'd wanted was to follow Sarah. I would have followed her anywhere. I hadn't had even an inkling that the repercussions from this moment would remain with me for decades, that despite how happy I'd be, heartache would follow.
Thank you for sharing that. This indeed was a learning ground experience about love for you in so many ways, wasn't it?
Absolutely. The book is definitely about this affair. And even though it's kind of engaged in affair, it was about learning about love. It was about figuring out who I was and what I wanted to be in the real world, and also discovering my sexuality. There was a lot going on then.
And when you met Sarah, just describe, if you would, the context for your meeting.
Sure. So I met her on an interview. I was interviewing for a summer job as an orientation counselor at UMass Amherst, where I was a student. And she was intimidating, very intimidating. And I remember screwing something up right away, right after the interview. And I thought she was going to fire me right after hiring me. But there was something about Sarah. She reminded me of past coaches I had had, kind of these tough women who I really wanted to impress, and do a good job for and work harder for.
You've described the fact that at the time, this was a secret affair, and you also had a lot of doubts about what you were doing, but there was kind of a parallel set of feelings going on here. You loved the involvement, the intimacy with her. You were also feeling a little odd about it and wondering what you were getting yourself into, right?
Yeah, I mean, for one thing, she had a partner, a long-term partner, so it was an affair, and it was secretive, and that was, here I was 23 being thrown into a real adult situation. So there was that part. And Sarah, we knew from the beginning this couldn't go anywhere. She said, this has to be our secret. And I was fine with that. Previous relationships, I kind of kept secret. I was still new to this. Was I gay? Was I not? What was that all about? But, there was also the age difference. And this was the early 90s, and it wasn't like today. But still, it was a huge age difference for any time. And I think, we'd think, well, what if we were together? But we would keep getting kind of snagged on that age difference. What would people think? 34 years is a pretty big age difference.
A wise friend and therapist once said to me that 1 year in a relationship is equivalent to 10 years of therapy. And I'm wondering, do you agree with that sentiment first? And secondly, if that's the case, what did you really learn about intimacy, love, attraction from being with Sarah?
Let's see. We were together really 9 years. I mean, even though we had been with other people, we were still secretly together. And so it's taken about 18 years to write the book. So maybe 2 years for every 1 year. But writing the book was therapy for me in just dealing with the loss. But I think it wasn't really until writing about it that I really started learning more about what I got out of that relationship with her, about learning about love and letting go and having that. I named the book Half In because we were together, but we were not together. We were like halfway in. And what I took from that relationship, unfortunately, part of that was that fear of being all in. And every subsequent relationship was pretty much half in. I couldn't love all the way. I was so fearful. And I don't know if it was fearful of getting hurt or maybe them dying, which is what happened with Sarah. But I really want to experience that again. I feel like now that I needed to get this book out into the world for myself, now that that secret was no longer a secret, I didn't have to hide behind it and be so fearful.
You mentioned that Sarah did have a longtime partner at the time, Linda. Do you have a sense of what you brought to her that she perhaps wasn't finding in fulfillment with Linda?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not sure. I had a line in the book. It was about maybe I was her one last chance on that merry-go-round of youth or something to grab that gold ring. I don't know if that was it or if just the way we connected on so many things, books and music. And yes, there was a huge age gap. And there were some things, I'd make fun of her for listening to NPR, which of course now that's all I listen to. But, maybe relationships go stale. Maybe I was just different than Linda in certain aspects. And Sarah said she was content with Linda. That was kind of how she was ready to just kind of live out the rest of her life with that. And I think I maybe came along and it was just something different or fresh or new.
And for you, It strikes me as I read the book that there were so many emotional components to the relationship. There was, for you, the flattery, the attention from an older person. I'm also sensing that she made you feel safe, valued, and appreciated. And could you talk a little bit about that? And what about that issue of safety and cherishment?
She did make me feel very safe. And I'm not sure it was because she was so much older and it wasn't safe in terms of financial or anything like that. Just this, someone who I revered and was so smart. And she just, yes, her love, the flattery of just, she thought everything I did was great. And I reveled in that. I think, when you're 23, you're out of school, you're not sure what you should be doing. You don't get that feedback from tests or teachers or anything. And I was just unsure of what I wanted to do with my life. And she was so supportive and encouraging. And I was also questioning my sexuality, and she just allowed me to be whoever I was and experiment with that and just in how I felt and who I thought I was. And I think that just made me feel really safe.
Is it fair to say that she changed the trajectory of your life?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I would say that. And not just in love in one aspect, but also in my career, being able to talk to anyone, being able to get in front of a group, having the confidence to just tackle any job that came my way. Definitely working for Sarah for all those years really helped with that as well.
You also mentioned in the book that I think, sort of in your more objective observations, that there were some things about the relationship that were not healthy and that you also had to process. Can you talk a little bit about those?
Well, sure. I think for one was keeping it a secret, definitely. And the lying was tough, but it became kind of second nature to me. And that was unfortunate. I think at some point I became more attracted to the drama in relationships than the actual relationships. And, I say at the end, I don't fault Sarah. She wasn't the villain in this story. I choose to remember the good times, but yeah, there were things that, these learned behaviors that I am trying to unlearn and look beyond.
Now, you self-identify as bisexual, and I'm curious, when you think about the nature of physical, emotional, and psychological connection for you, how is it different being with a woman versus being with a man?
I mean, aside from the obvious differences, I feel like I'm just attracted to the person, someone who excites me, someone who is interesting and smart and gets my humor, and just someone I want to be with. And, the longest relationship was with a man for 9 years. And I just, it's funny. Everybody asks that, but I just don't, aside from, the physical parts, the rest I just want a best friend. I just want someone who gets me and I get them. And I just love being with.
One of the things I noticed in the book was the conflict I think you had with yourself at times with Sarah. You loved being with her, but it was a situation of being half in. And so I think, I kind of chuckled at one point. You said that here I am, we spend all of our time making out in her car. And and what did you think might happen if you kind of hung in there?
At the beginning, the first year was the real intense part of this affair. And I think at the beginning, I was okay with, the hiding out, but I was realizing that for the first time, I was having these feelings of what were they? And it was love. And I wanted more. I didn't want to be, relegated to the other woman. But on the other hand, I was still fighting my fear of being found out, about was my sexuality. It was still kind of closeted, and about the age difference. So there were constant battles, and that was really tough.
You've talked about these struggles of keeping this a secret. I also know, just from our conversations, that your parents have really been there for you. Talk about what the journey of their own awareness and acceptance has been like. And you were initially fearful about sharing all of this with them.
Yeah, they didn't know about this until after Sarah died. And then I shared in little bits, they asked questions and I would give a little here and there, but they didn't really know the extent until actually, I would say, my dad had edited a version a few years ago, but it wasn't until the pandemic that I just really came clean and said, I really, really loved her. And it was scary during the pandemic for a lot of reasons. Here I get choked up, but it's still so new. But talking to them and finally getting it out, and they said, "We love you no matter what," and that was, it's heartening. Early on in the book, I mentioned how when I first talked to my dad about my sexuality, and he said, "Well, we always thought what we'd want in a son-in-law. We'll just switch that." So I get my humor a lot from him, but it's been a journey for them as well. I think it was easier for my dad. My mom was a little more fearful of, wanting to protect me and maybe not so sure about how society would accept it. But, during the pandemic, when I just said this was it, and now I'm coming out with the book, and now recently with all the feedback from the book, my mom is getting more comfortable because at first she said, I don't know if I want to share your book with my book club. 3 of the people from her book club were at my talk, and now they all want to do it for their next. And so I think it's a journey for me, but it's been a journey for them. And so I think it's been helpful for all of us.
Well, and we should say that at this point, as we talk today, the book has scored very highly on Amazon, right? In a number of categories. Is that right?
Yeah, in 6 different categories now, it hit number 1 spots, and it's incredible. I just am stunned because for so long, this book was between me and my laptop. Nobody knew. And so it's nice that, my friends and people are sending me photos of them holding the book. And it just, as Sarah would say, it makes my heart sing.
Well, and so do you feel Sarah's with you right now, kind of enjoying this success that you're having?
I hope she is. It's funny. This morning I was driving back from going on a bike ride, and the song I'm All Right came on by Kenny Loggins, which was the song I was listening to, which really made me change course and go back and see her, which started the whole affair. So was it a sign or a coincidence? Either one. I love it.
Wow. Kind of like the rainbow in the sky the other day, remember, at your
Yes.
book signing?
That's amazing.
Yes. So I have to ask you, because you mentioned it, what was it like to have your dad edit your book when you had some kind of steamy scenes in there?
Yeah, if you've never had a parent or your father edit your sex scenes, I highly recommend it. I think at some point I had to just distance myself from this 23-year-old in the book. And, my dad is so smart. He's brilliant and he's a great editor and writer. And I wanted it to be the best it could be. So I think that's why I injected some humor into those scenes as well, because it kind of kept it less serious, less, scary, I guess.
Memoir is such a difficult literary genre to write because I think the author is so close to their subject matter. And I remember some years ago being in a writer's workshop in Provincetown with Norman Mailer. I was one of 5 people with him for a day. And we were talking about this issue of the writer's voice. So this is a 2-part question, one of which is, as you were writing this book, and you talked about the fact you had to really cut it down in terms of length, what guided you in terms of how you proceeded with that? How did you kind of condense it to be the length that it is? That's one question. And secondly, what did you discover about your writer's voice as you were writing this book?
So cutting it down, I'm a professional organizer, so I looked at it as decluttering, but my editors would say a memoir needs to be around 80,000 words or, around that. So I said, okay, I had to get to work and I edited this thing, if not 250 times. I mean, over and over. And every time I would go through it and think, is this needed? Is this part of the story? Does it move the story along? Can I live without it? Or can I say this 500 words in 50 words? And I think it was just over and over and over. And when I was a columnist, I was used to writing, rewriting and editing until it got tight, until I could read through without, getting caught up on a word. So I think that was part of the muse of cutting it down. It was you got to get it, down. And what was the other part of the question?
Your writer's
Oh, the voice.
voice. What did you discover about that?
Right. These two-part questions throw me always. The writer's voice. So I started writing the book by using my journal entries from that time when I was 23, 24, and our letters. So that was the voice I was trying to hold on to, that kind of young, a little sarcastic voice. It's still me in a lot of ways, but I tried to keep it as that young person. And I interjected some of myself as older now to see what I've learned from then and what still kind of haunts me today. But I was really kind of focused on making sure that that voice stayed. And, that voice, even though that 23-year-old no longer exists, in some ways she still does. I've been immersed in the story for so long that it still almost feels like it happened yesterday in some aspects. But yeah.
Do you have particularly poignant moments, Felice, that you remember of being with Sarah? Maybe you were out to dinner, or just it was an intimate moment at home, or you're in the living room reading the New York Times together. Do you have a couple of those that you could share with us?
I do. A lot. Just here, I choked up again. What's wrong with me? I, I'm on the Cape right now, and I switch my time between here and New York City, but there's so many places on the Cape when Sarah visited me that still I'll bike by, I'll drive by, and I'll just get this boom memory. And one is in Mother's Park in Centerville. I remember when she came to visit, we met in the park and we sat on this bench, the only bench there was at the time. And my parents were supposed to have gone away and they ended up staying for the weekend. So, I just remember sitting there with her and she gave me a CD as a present. When I go by the Indian restaurant in Hyannis, every time I go pick up takeout there or sit in there, I remember that the conversation we had, it's just right there. And yes, because I've written about it and edited it so many times that it's still so fresh. Or when I've gone to Provincetown and, the place where I stayed at with her, and it's just right there on the surface of my memory. It just comes back in a second.
That's really beautiful. And, I recall from reading the book some scenes where you talked about being aware of her age and sort of loving her and feeling attracted to her, but also being aware that she was quite a bit older. And so you talked about the sagging skin, I think, in one point, and how it was different from what it felt like being with a younger same-sex partner. And these are really poignant moments. And I wanted to ask, and I asked you this at the book launch, as you were writing this book, the emotions that got triggered in you. Could you just share a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, as you can see, I'm always being triggered by the emotions. I thought talking about my grandfather's book about the Holocaust triggered emotions, but this is my story and it's still pretty raw. And I think one of the reasons is because it's now open and it's now out there. And it was the secret for so long. And even though it triggered emotions then, it's still triggering the emotions. And I welcome the emotions now. I feel like the pain comes out through tears. And I think acknowledging those pains or those memories, I welcome them. I feel like it's now good emotions.
It's been transmuted. Sarah called you Blue. That was her nickname for you, right? Where did that come from?
So Sarah was a Girl Scout growing up. So she was always prepared. And one thing she wore these blue blocker sunglasses with, those orange tinted, funny looking sunglasses. And she had them in her car. She had extra pairs on her golf bag at work, at home. And so she said she called me Blue for the blue blockers because I blocked out all that rational thinking she had. She just wanted to be with me and I blocked it out. And, it's funny now I only wear blue blocker sunglasses when I cycle. They're great. Yeah.
You've talked about what you learned from Sarah, what the experience of being in relationship with her was like. What do you think she learned from you?
One of the questions I used to ask her was, do you love me more than you love Linda? And she would say, I love you in different ways. And I think for the two of us, she had said, I've never loved anyone like this. And maybe it was the age difference. Maybe for her, there was a little protectiveness with her. She wanted to protect me and it was just different. we have to be different people to, I think, be with someone with such a different age disparity. I've always been liked my older teachers and coaches, and I think I've always kind of been an older soul. And I think she might have been attracted to that. And maybe it was part of my youthfulness she was attracted to. I don't know. It was just something different.
Yeah. Just a couple of more questions, but one thing that strikes me is in the book, you're really in a conversation, a dialogue with yourself about this relationship, even as you were enjoying the time with her. Did you worry about getting lost in the relationship in a way that would not have been healthy?
You mean getting lost in terms of?
Emotionally, in terms of your own identity?
I think I probably was lost, but I wasn't worried in terms of it because I had no idea. I mean, I was so young and new to relationships that I think it was after, and in writing this book and finding myself, I think that really helped in terms of feeling lost, just confused or not knowing until now.
So in retrospect, knowing what you know now about yourself, about other people, about relationships, about love, what would be your advice to another 23-year-old man or woman, non-binary, transgender person about how to approach love and relationships?
Please be all in. And I know that's not easy, but regardless whether you're half in or all in, I think you just have to be honest with yourself. I think it's easier now. It's probably still not easy though, even though the society and culture is more accepting. I think it doesn't matter. I think it really depends on who you are. At the book talk, a friend who I've been friends with since we were 6 sent me a text and she said, "I wish you had told me what you were going through. I felt bad you didn't trust me enough to tell me." And I wrote her back and I said, "It had nothing to do with that. I didn't trust you. It was my own journey." And I think your own journey is going to be different from everyone else's. And you have to just listen to yourself and, know that your choices are your choices. And if you can find someone to talk to who can help you just understand what you're going through, I can't tell anybody to do something different than I did, or be all in. I mean, I think you have to be wherever you're comfortable and know that, love is love, like we say now.
And to get the most out of a relationship, how important is it, in your view, to be willing to take some risks?
Probably a lot. I think risks have been scary for me, especially after Sarah. But putting this book out there was like a risk. And I feel like it was, my second chance to have put Sarah and I out there. And I get choked up. I'm sorry. There's so
That's okay.
Still, but
you're being very real. And well, let's wrap this interview. You have a lovely quote. Let's end with that. It's from the book's epilogue. Am I correct?
Yes.
So I just invite you to share that with our listeners, and then we'll close.
For years, I thought my fear stemmed from what others would think if they knew I'd been in love with a much older woman. I'd been mistaken. The real fear was examining what I had thought about myself. I'd been judging myself harshly for loving someone society deemed an unacceptable match and had been anticipating that same judgment from others. Secrecy enabled me to compartmentalize this fear, which then intensified my shame. My heightened shame then kept me silent and kept me fearful. It was a vicious cycle, but not anymore. Writing my story has helped me get the angst off my chest and the spinning thoughts out of my head, but it wasn't enough. Releasing the book was like cleaning out the clutter in my heart and mind and making room to fall in love, to let love in again. Sarah, despite her faults, I don't regret our affair, nor do I blame Sarah for the path my life has taken. She was never the villain in my story. Yes, Sarah was fallible. I see that now. She cheated on Linda with a young, impressionable woman, but that's not the takeaway I choose. As heavy as my heart was, it was being used for what hearts are intended to do: love.
Well, Felice Cohen, thank you for sharing your story with our podcast listeners and for writing a really wonderful and moving testimony to love.
Thank you, Rick. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to today's interview. Founded in 1973, PFLAG is the first and largest organization for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer people and their parents, families, friends, and allies. We have over 400 chapters and more than 200,000 members and supporters nationwide. Our members come from every generation and live in cities, small towns, and rural areas across the United States. PFLAG is committed to creating a world where diversity is celebrated and all people are respected, valued, and affirmed. For more information about PFLAG, explore the rest of this website or visit PFLAG National at pflag.org.